Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another great event. Let me introduce myself. My name is Emmanuel Kim. I am the Korea Foundation Kim Renaud Associate Professor in the East Asian Languages Department. And I am very proud to present the event today, which is co-hosted by the Triple Alliance, the Holy Trinity, if you will, the NRC, the Korea event, and TERP. And so I'm going to speak on behalf of the Korea aspect from EALL, and that is the Kim Renaud East Asian Humanities Lecture Series. And what we do here in the Korea event is we invite scholars from all over, and we have this kind of cultural intellectual exchange, and we allow this kind of humanities to really explore beyond national boundaries, departmental boundaries. And we're so glad we can co-host this event with the NRC and really expand this kind of cultural and intellectual exchange. And we want to thank the founder of Korea, Professor Emeritus Youngie Kim Renaud, who is not here, but she is joining us on Zoom, and her wonderful husband, Bertrand Renaud. And we couldn't host this event without their generous support and their real encouragement in our department. So we want to thank Youngie Kim Renaud. And now I want to hand it over to the co-director of TERP, and she will briefly explain what that program is all about. Thank you.
When someone's important, you'll be introduced multiple times. There'll be several people parading around. That's us. My name is Alice Jobin. I'm professor of English, International Affairs, and a couple of other things. And I'm involved with the Taiwan Education and Research Program, TERP, TERP. You can follow us online if you search that keyword in Elliott School. We're passionate about Taiwan studies, Taiwan cultural studies, that is kind of bring a humanistic perspective to the study of policy in the Elliott School. And this is our highlight event of the year to have Chris Lupke with us. And I am here to introduce our honor speaker, who is professor of Chinese cultural studies at the University of Alberta, all the way in Canada. He's traveled a long way to be here. A scholar of modern and contemporary Chinese literature and cinema, Professor Lupke is the author of the Sinophone cinema of Hou Xiaoxian, Culture, Style, Violence, and Motion, which came out in 2016. He's a well-respected translator, very, very prolific. He's written, edited, co-edited, or translated 7 books, including The Magnitude of Ming, New Perspective on Contemporary Chinese Poetry, Chinese Poetic Modernisms, Dictionary of Literary Biography, Chinese Poets since 1949, and the multi-volume reference work Wiley-Blackwell Companion to World Literature. He's also edited or co-edited 5 special journal issues. Professor Lupke's translation of Ye Shitao's monumental A History of Taiwan Literature was awarded the Aldo and Jean Scaglione Award from the Modern Language Association, MLA. And his career-long dedication has won him the Michael de la Hoyette Award for Distinguished Editing from the Rocky Mountain MLA. Lupke's current research focuses on the Confucian notion of xiao, or filial piety, filiality in contemporary Chinese culture, which is a bedrock philosophical notion and popular value that dates to before the times of Confucius in China and maintains its relevance in Chinese society today. So his talk today, as you can see, is entitled Duty in Motion, Polarities of Filial Identity, and Contemporary Sinophone Culture. I'm very much looking forward to this talk. Welcome, Professor Lupke.
Thank you, Dr. Jobin, and thank you, Dr. Kim. It's an honor to be here, and I just want to thank some other people first. So I want to thank our workers, Lisa and Adam, who've done a great job in facilitating my trip. It's always makes it easier when you have reliable and dedicated staff. And in addition to Alexa, who's been my friend for, I think, since about 2006 or so. I also want to thank Dr. Leanna Chen, who I've known quite a while as well. And it's great to be here and great to meet some new people, including some of my virtual friends from Facebook. Anyway, I'm honored to be here. And today I am going to talk about filiality. It's a project I've been working on for a long time, and I still have a little ways to go. So the title of this talk is Duty and Emotion, Polarities and Filial Identity in Contemporary Chinese Sinophone Culture. And although I have been working on filiality for a long time, this is a mostly pretty much a completely new talk. And so it's still a little bit rough and jagged and kind of in pieces, because I'm not exactly completely rethinking the notion of filiality, but what I am is I'm considering a new and fresh component to it, which is emotion or affect. And so uh, I think for those of you in East Asian studies, you're probably familiar with this notion of filiality, which if you ask people, they'll say something like, well, it means respect for your parents, or maybe respect for your grandparents, and doing the right thing, and also it has something to do with Confucianism or Confucius. So there's a few things that we should first clarify about this notion of filiality. So as Alexa correctly noted, it actually is a pre-Confucian notion. So many of the things that Confucian did, and certainly filiality or xiao is at the core of his thinking, were to identify important cultural features in ancient Chinese society that preceded him. So if you read the Analects, or if you read the Mencius or Xunzi, the two books that came after Confucius, you'll see that they're constantly referring to what they call the ancients. So those ancients could have lived 800 to 1500 years before Confucius did, before Mencius did, before Xunzi did. So this is really, really old. So Confucius did not invent the notion of xiao or filiality. He identified it, he codified it, he raised it in stature, and he essentially set it up as the cardinal virtue in Chinese society. So that's number one. The second thing is it's very closely attached to ancestral worship. So one of the things that I'm really interested in contemporary and modern and contemporary Chinese society, which is my area and mostly like literature and cinema, is why is this notion so powerful? Why is it so stubbornly resilient, and why is it so persistent? Not only over centuries, but in the modern era when it has been confronted with really powerful critique and opposition. And my own thinking is, or at least it has been, that it's intimately attached to the notion of ancestral belief and ancestral worship in very, very early China. In China, of course, in the belief system in ancient China, there wasn't a sense of uh, a monotheistic God, like a Judeo slash Christian slash Islamic God, and one that is in a way kind of emulates humans in certain ways, or vice versa, or whatever, that is a kind of an entity, a subject of its own. Rather, the most important celestial beings in the Chinese thinking were ancestors themselves. So when when old folks in your family die, they become ancestors. But you have to, those of us who are left remaining in the terrestrial world, have to commemorate them. We have to pay obeisances to them. We have to offer rituals to them, sacrifices, and we have to remember them. And so there are things like ancestral plaques, ancestral altars, periodic offerings, and so on and so forth to do this. And if one's descendants die, then one essentially ceases to be an ancestor, because you're only an ancestor insofar as people in the terrestrial world are maintaining this tether to the celestial world, commemorating you, and so on and so forth. So that's why it's critical for people to have children. So when asked Confucius, when someone asked Confucius, well, what is filial piety? He said the three most important things of filial. There are three important things about filiality. Nobody remembers the other two, but the number one remember is you have to have children, okay? And especially you have to have male children, because they maintain the patriarchal line. And so the next step in that is we have to sort of look at it as being a legitimating ideology for patriarchy and patrilineal society and continuity. And in a way, we could look at it from a gender studies point of view. I think you could say that what filiality really does is it takes our attention away from the fact that in the process of biological reproduction, where the center is on women, it takes our attention away from that and puts it on the male. And this is what we could call social reproduction. So social reproduction versus biological reproduction. This is a notion I've drawn from Pierre Bourdieu, who I'll get to in a second. And the notion is basically that, obviously women are the most important aspect of biological reproduction. At least 99%. The male's job is very quick, very fun, and over very soon. And then the rest is up to women. Okay, so how do we maintain a society in which males call the shots, males dominate, males run everything, when it's really the female who is the essential? And so this sense, this ideological notion of filiality actually allows us to do this. So there are other aspects to it, like it's the fact that it's ubiquitous. And by the way, we see filiality is not simply a Chinese notion or value or social value. It's all over East Asia. So as soon as you start digging into the cultures of Korea or to Japan or even Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, you're going to hit filiality very, very fast, right? So it's a transnational notion. It's been around forever, and it is everywhere, right? And there's a certain metaphysical certitude to it, as Donald Holtzman, the French scholar, said in an important article in the Journal of the American Oriental Society about 25 years ago. He said that he was very intrigued, Holtzman was, with the fact that there is this unquestioning veracity that has to do with filiality. So for example, he was very interested in some of the extreme expressions of filiality. So for example, if your parents are starving to death, you should be willing to shave off chunks of your body and serve them up to them, preferably braised, maybe with a nice soy sauce, or maybe wrapped in a baozi would be very nice. I mean, we're not barbarians here, But in any event, it's intriguing that the notion is so powerful that in order to express filial devotion, if one's parents are in peril, that one would damage oneself, even kill oneself, in order to serve the parents. Now that's very, very powerful. So from that, we get a sense of metaphysical certitude. There is actually voluminous scholarship on the notion of filiality in Chinese studies, quite a bit in Japanese studies, and quite a lot in Korean studies too. There's a scholar who's passed away, was at Columbia University, was Jahyun Habush. Did you know her? And she did an annotated translation of the memoirs of Lady Hyegyong, who was a princess in the Chosun period, about the early High Chosun. And if you read, and this is four, I think, different memoirs were written at different stages, and it's particularly remarkable because she was the mother of the crown prince, who was actually essentially executed by her husband, his own father. So she goes through a lot of stuff in this, but the one thing that's keen goes throughout the whole book, Memoirs of Lady Hegel, is the notion of filiality, and she tried to argue that her son actually was a filial person. Another really good example from Korea that we could fast forward to the contemporary era is the contemporary writer Park Wan-so, also unfortunately passed away, who wrote many really good novels in the 70s and 80s. And one of them, and I don't read Korean, so I'm handicapped, but she has a novel called The Naked Tree, which is essentially about a young woman whose father and brothers were killed in bombings during the Korean War, and the only people left are the mother and the daughter. And the mother is very sort of saturated with notions of Confucianism and filiality, and thinking that she's completely bereft because her sons have died. And the daughter has real, complexes over this, anxieties over this fact. So I see filiality is operating in that book too, not necessarily as a good thing always. So we see it all over. And in modern society in China, we see it in a lot of works. So we see it in the works of Lu Xun and Jin and Ding Ling and Zhang Ailing or Eileen Zhang, Lu Ling, Wang Wenxing, Bai Xianyong, Wang Anyi, Mo Yan, Zhang Yimou, Chen Kaige. These are all figures that I'll be dealing with in the book I'm working on, or it may end up being two books. Anyway, it's all over the place. But what does not exist in the scholarship, though, so there's scholarship saturated Chinese studies and in Korean studies and in Japanese studies, but what is lacking is a systematic study in modern and contemporary Chinese literature and or cinema. But that's good, though, because that gives me an opportunity to write a book on it, or maybe two. Almost everyone refers to filiality in their work, because it is an important concept. It's all over the place. But most people don't define it or think about it in a systematic way. They often will refer to it, they will remark on it, and then they will move on. And there's one or two articles that are on filiality, and that's basically it. But pretty much everyone mentions it at least. So a systematic book length study, though, has not been done, although there are many other fields. There's also a lot of systematic studies of it in anthropological work, like Emmanuel Xu and people like this of earlier generations of anthropology, and in sociology, and in women's studies, in population studies, because filiality is very connected with the one-child policy. And so in some of the work, like Susan Greenhalgh, who's work on the one-child policy, talks about it, as do others who work on the one-child policy. And so just to let you know, my sort of theoretical understanding is I appeal to an array of thinkers or theorists. Probably the most important one is Pierre Bourdieu, who's a French sociologist who wrote many books, but one of his important books was called The Outline of a Theory of Practice. He wrote another book called Distinction. And in this book of Outline of a Theory of Practice, he puts out some important concepts like field and also the notion of habitus, or maybe habitus. My French is not very good at all. He also talks about cultural and biological reproduction. So when Bourdieu talks about habitus, or a field of a range of behavior, what he's essentially getting at in his own thinking is that he's very intrigued with the idea that when people do things, when they act out, when they exhibit behavior, people like to think of themselves as acting spontaneously. Like what I'm doing now, I'm the one who's deciding what I'm doing. Nobody's forcing me. I'm not a puppet. Okay, I'm doing it. I am saying what I'm saying, and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, Bourdieu is really interesting idea that people perceive what they do as being of their own volition, of their own agency, and spontaneous. But on the other hand, he's also intrigued by the fact that most behavior is normative in the sense that it may not be exactly the same as other people, but it's within a certain range of acceptability. So we don't like freak out. We don't, generally people don't do things that are outside a certain range. And if we do sort of suddenly do things that are outside a certain range, it's immediately recognized as such. And people will remark on it. You get back in your seat, calm down, whatever, you know? And the third thing is he's very interested in the fact that these things are very socially specified. So they're different for different cultures, right? So in other words, when it comes to habitus, Bourdieu is really interested in the idea that we go about our daily lives and we think that we're acting spontaneous, but there's this, what we're doing is not exactly robotic, but it's within a certain range, and we very seldom go off the rails in terms of that behavior. And that I think reminds me very much of filiality, where people kind of take for granted what it is, especially East Asian people. They don't reflect too deeply on it, but they behave in filial ways. And if people ask them, what are you doing or why are you doing it, they can pause and sort of explain it. It's not unconscious. It's not a Freudian thing, but it's more like it's simply just a taken for granted thing. It's something that's sort of slightly below the surface that people sort of used to doing out of habit, hence the word habitus. And if you notice, like if you ask people today, they very well would probably not, at least not the first thing they would say would not be, well, it has to do with my ancestors. They would say, no, I do it because I love my parents and I respect my parents and I want to do good by my parents and so on and so forth. But it's such a powerful, almost like a social obsession or a social compulsion. And if you probably push people farther, they would say, yeah, somewhere in our house, there's an altar, there's a tablet, or there's a book, or maybe at the holidays, we will put out food that's a kind of a symbolic sacrifice for our grandparents, our great grandparents, and so on and so forth. And then in really extreme cases, people can trace their lineage back a long, long way. So one thing that's really interesting to me, and then I want to get down to the text that I want to talk about today, is I recently read the novel The Dark Road, which is In Zhi Dao, so Dao de Dao, so by Ma Jian. This is an infamous novel banned in China. I mean, it's really banned in China. It's not like one of these, yeah, banned in China, and you find out that it's available outside the front gate of a university on someone's cart. That kind of a ban. No. Ma Jian is persona non grata in China. And he has written a novel about Tiananmen uprising and massacre. But he's written this novel, which is essentially about the one-child policy. And it's intriguing to me. It's a gruesome book, by the way. It is translated by his wife as the Dark Road. But what really kind of shocked me was how perfectly it fit into my study, even though I had it in the back of my mind at some point, I got to get around to this, but I only read it within the last 6 months or so. And in it, the main character is a woman having children, and her husband, his name is actually Gongzi. All right. So that's his nickname. He's got a full name, but he goes by Gongzi in the novel. And he can trace his lineage back like something like 76 generations directly to Confucius. All right. So someone like that, I mean, that's off the charts. You know, that's the gold standard, right there, filiality. So in any event, what Ma Jian describes in his novel very much supports a lot of the things that I've sort of outlined for you here. But I was very interested in 3 books that came out a few years ago. And so I wrote a review article about them. And I just want to talk about one of those, which is Maram Epstein's book, which is called Orthodox Passions, Narrating Filial Love During the High Qing. I'm going to read a little bit because this pretty much comes out of my notes from my review of this book. So Epstein goes into considerable detail regarding the deep interior emotion that is invested in the practice of filiality. And let me just say, just to make it brief, I'll only talk about the last chapter of her book, which is a forceful rejoinder to the notion voiced by scholars such as C.T. Xia and others, that the self in pre-modern Chinese fiction lacks the deep affective interiority that sets it apart, and therefore backward vis-a-vis the modern self and modern narrative, and most important, Western narrative. Epstein suggests that, on the contrary, it is the manner of expression, the circumstance in which great emotional control and rhetorical reticence were required of mourners that typified the way affective interiority is communicated in subtle and muted ways. Careful perusal of mourning records reveal that private emotions indeed were revealed publicly, but that they had to be done so in ritually encoded ways in which mourners negotiated the conflict between expressions of genuine grief and sentiment on the one hand, and ritual prescriptions on the other. Returning to the contention that she voiced at the beginning of her book, she reasserts that A, we need to recognize that filial sentiment is a primary form of emotion in late imperial China, and that B, filiality is a favored site of subjective self-expression. In order to delineate how the ritual encoding of emotional interiority works in this material, Epstein traces rhetorical continuities in the writings of a diverse set of late imperial intellectuals that span the late Ming and Qing periods. She argues that rather than the suppression of emotion, filial sentiment in some cases involves a deflection of emotive expression. One of her case studies shows how the major intellectual Lu Xun displaced his grief onto other relatives in his descriptions because of the taboo of directly expressing his emotional loss. The news of Lin's elder brother's death came in the form of a letter. Lin Shu translated the letter's content into a poem to give to his mother. Then he traveled to retrieve the body. He lavished praise on the brother's exemplary behavior and ultimate sacrifice while making no direct reference to his own emotions. Through his third-party rendering, he was able to verbalize affection by proxy while maintaining a subdued demeanor himself. An anatomy of similar episodes in the lives of the other intellectuals is offered by Epstein as testimony to the fact that emotional interiority was real, but it was revealed only through oblique means. So what this suddenly revealed to me was that the opposition between filiality on the one hand and emotion on the other was a completely modern prism of looking at the pre-modern, and it essentially blinded us to alternative ways of emotional expression. And this is what basically Epstein dedicates her book to, in a wide variety of different ways with a wide variety of different kinds of texts and so on and so forth. She's a little bit harsh, I will say, Epstein, in her estimate of modern scholars, but also modern cultural figures like the May 4th people, like Lu Xun and Chen Duxiu and Wu Yu and Ba Jin, who all attacked the notion of filiality and said that it was basically stunting the ability of Chinese people to have emotionally adult lives, of full-blown lives. Okay, so this is in the 20th century. What you get is all sorts of critique of filiality. So with Maram Epstein's essentially overturning of the notion of how we think of filiality, I began to think a little bit more about modern contemporary literature and cinema, and the ways in which emotion actually is intertwined with filiality. So for this talk, and I will just briefly give some examples because I'm still kind of thinking about this stuff, but also they're all examples that you could go and look to yourselves, you know, so I don't need to drill too deeply into any one of these individual works, but I'll just give you some examples. And since this is a talk primarily on Sinophone material, I think all of these works are produced by, we'll say, Sinophone intellectuals or Chinese speaking intellectuals who work outside the PRC. But I think that you could also apply this to stuff that comes from the PRC. So the works I'm just going to mention are Wang Wenxing's Family Catastrophe, Jia Bian, which is over here on the left. And then the next one is Bai Xianyong's novel, Nieze, or Crystal Boys. And then the third one is I'm just going to talk about one short story by the writer Huang Zhenmei, which is The Fish, or Yu. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a long poem by this poet Zhang Er, who was born and raised in mainland China, but has lived in the United States for a long time, over 30 years. And then if I have any time left at all, I'll talk about Hou Xiaoshen's film, The Assassins, so we'll see what happens. So Jia Bian, I'm just curious, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but has anyone read this novel at all? Anybody? You guys in the front row must have read it. It's an amazing novel, and in my opinion, one of the greatest novels of any kind in the modern era, but especially Chinese. It isn't been read as an anti-filial novel. I wrote an article, though, about it that appeared in Boundary 2 about 25 years ago, arguing that it's not exactly a filial novel, rather it's a novel. It's a bifurcated narrative that has a very ambiguous tone to it. It's really got two tones going on. So I call it an internal problematic, because on the one hand, it features a major conflict between the father and son. So it's classic anti-filial literature that we do get in the modern era. And it's a history of the family disintegration. But on the other hand, it's a split narrative that also has a narrative with describing the son going in search of the father after the father has fled the home. So it's ambiguous. And I was thinking of it particularly for this talk in terms of the large number of outbursts emotionally in it. So I think there's really two major emotions that go on in this novel, Family Catastrophe, or Jia Bian. One is this over the top, you know, breaking furniture, breaking dishes, expressions of anger and grief and anxiety and conflict and emotion like that. So it is emotion, right? On the one hand, and then on the other, of when the son is searching for the father, a sense of remorse, a very powerful and verbalized sense of remorse as he goes all over the island of Taiwan, trying to find his father, which he never succeeds in doing. Second one is Bai Xianyong's work, Nieze, or Crystal Boys, written a little bit after Wang Wenxing's novel. Maybe it was inspired by it a little bit, but the subject matter is quite different. So it is a queer novel. In fact, I believe it is considered to be the first explicitly queer novel in Chinese. And it's a very thorough exploration of gay subculture in the 60s and 70s in Taipei. And in my opinion, it's a very well-written novel, very beautifully written. By Shen Yong is a very beautiful writer. But the theme of filiality also is important in this book. But interestingly, it's a little bit less of the conflict. Of course, the novel is sort of germinated on the notion of anti-filial, essentially rejection from the fathers in the book who don't, most of them don't appear in the book, but they've thrown their sons out. They've expelled their sons from the family because they're gay, and they've ended up in this sort of underground society in Taipei. But there is one surrogate father figure in the book named Papa Fu, and Papa Fu is a elderly retired general from the military whose son committed suicide because he was gay and because of his conflict with Papa Fu many years previous. So Papa Fu now is sort of become a surrogate father for these young gay men. And of course, he feels a lot of remorse himself. And there's even a really interesting sort of reconciliation by proxy between him and one of the main characters, even though the main character is not his actual son. So they both kind of work through their anxieties with their father on the one hand and son on the other through this proxy reconciliation that they go through ritually in the narrative. There's a lot of violence and abuse in the work, and tied to things like physical violence, abandonment, rejection, vulnerability. That would be socially, it would be economically, it would be in terms of housing, it would be in terms of protection from the police, who were rather homophobic. And then also mental illness and emotional trauma. And I bring this out because, again, in this book, there are many really riveting scenes of just profound emotional outburst. Characters are crying and screaming and convulsing and so on and so forth. So we have to recognize the fact that emotion does play into this work too. I'm going to turn now to another writer from Taiwan, Huang Chunming. So Huang Chunming could be essentially distinguished from the first two writers because the first two writers were actually born in mainland China. So by many people in Taiwan, they're not considered to be ethnically Taiwanese, even though in the case of Wang Wenxing, he spent, I think, all but about 6 or 7 years of his life in Taiwan. And in Bai Shenyong's case, he came to Taiwan around 1949. His father was an extremely important general during the Republican era. And Bai Shenyong essentially grew up in Taiwan from school age through college, and then ended up in the United States, where he worked and he wrote for many decades, but he really always had a very tight connection back to Taiwan and spends a lot of time there. I think he's actually there right now. But he's also spent a lot of time in mainland China, so he doesn't, I think, view himself to be culturally Taiwanese, and he doesn't speak Taiwanese, but he is kind of part of both Taiwan and mainland China. So Huang Chunming is 100% Taiwanese, which means his first language would be Southern Min or Minanhua, and everything he writes about completely reflects these ordinary people who've lived for generations in Taiwan. And Huang Chunming, although different from in style, personally speaking, from Wang Wenxing and Bai Shenyong, is just a wonderful storyteller, and he's particularly good at his short stories. So he has a short story called The Fish, or Yu, which is, it's very short. It's only about 8 pages or 9 pages or so. And it's basically about a young boy, and he might be about 9 or 10 years old. He's very poor, living with his grandfather, living up in the mountain area of northeastern Taiwan. And so it's a fairly impoverished area. It's not a great place to grow crops. They grow they mainly grow sweet potatoes, which is very starchy, very sweet root vegetable, and not reflective of a balanced diet if that's all you eat. In any event, he's sent off to be an apprentice to a carpenter down in a coastal village at a very, very young age. It's pretty rough. He gets a chance to come back, and his grandfather had repeatedly told him, when you come back, bring a big fish from the market with you, which he does. And so he rides his bicycle all the way up the mountain with this fish tied to it. But on the way up, the fish falls off and he crushes it and is destroyed. And he gets to the top and he has this enormous, bizarre confrontation with the grandfather. And it kind of revolves around him swearing that he actually did have a fish. And the grandfather saying, I believe you actually, but ultimately the grandson just keeps repeating this over and over again until the grandfather's fed up and then gives him a beating. It's a really weird story in that sense, but it's also extremely emotional. It's almost like a lyric in my opinion. It's almost not even like a narrative. And it kind of, in a sort of a gem-like fashion, crystallizes this weird, conflicted relationship between intergenerations that's informed by the notion of filiality. Incidentally, it's not the only story by Huang Chunming that depicts grandparents with grandchildren, so skipping a generation, which is also a very popular relationship in East Asian society that we're not so familiar with in North America, I think. So he has a story called The Story of Qing Fan, Grandpa Qing Fan, so Qing Fan Gong de Gu Shi. It's a really beautiful story. So if you have a chance, you might want to read it, but because we don't have time, I'm going to move on. And that brings me to Zhang Er's poetry. So see if I have anything here on her. Yes, I do. In recent decades, I've gotten really interested in poetry, mainly because I'm getting old and tired of people telling me what to do, so I just do what I want. And poetry is absolutely useless, especially modern contemporary poetry. At least classical Chinese poetry, people have respect for. So it may be useless, but people say, yeah, but it's better than anything else, so you can't tell me what to do. But contemporary poetry can't even hide behind that sort of mystique of pre-modern poetry. But I like that even more because it's sort of in the waning years of my professional life of a way of sticking it to the man, I guess. So I like all sorts of contemporary poetry. I mainly work on the poet Xiao Kaiyu. I don't know if anybody knows who this is. But this poet, Zhang Er, who works in the United States, by the way, she wasn't born in the year 19. Sorry about that. I guess that's why I stopped working on this. But I need to look it up. I'm guessing she was born around 1970. All right, let's just say 1960. Did you look it up? Awesome. Well, we won't say to her. We'll say you look very young. We'll say that. Thank you. So, but I do know her, and I've paid attention to her poetry over the years. And just between us, I peer reviewed this book for publication when it came out in a book-length translation, and I loved it because it's a narrative poem that depicts her returning back to her ancestral home she'd never been before. So notice that in China, people say, where are you from? And you'll say something like, I'm from Chicago or whatever. And there's a no, where are you from? And it's, yeah, I'm from Shanxi, which is where she's from. I've never been there before, but that's where I'm from, So that's the ancestral home, the Zuji. And she was basically, I think, born and raised in Beijing, lived in the US for a long, long time. And she went back to participate in the ritual reinterment of her grandfather. And the poem is then writing a long narrative description of this experience. And I just think it's really interesting. It's a very powerful depiction of the way ritual remembrance can help assuage diaspora. So here's someone who has obviously been, by virtue of the fact she lives and works in the US, and married to an American, cut off from her family. It's a big thing for East Asian people to be cut off like that. It's bigger, I think, than those of us who sort of worship at the altar of individuality. There's also a lot of description of the pastoral nature in rural Shanxi province. And although it's, I would call it sort of emotionally sedate, it's kind of a calm work, it's sort of a contemplative work. But it describes, there's a tone of great affection in the work with her grandparents and her granddaughter, as well as her uncle, who serves as a guide. And very tragically, it was right after this event that quite suddenly her uncle also died. So she kind of incorporated some of that into the poem too. And so I just wanted to give you that example as it's a kind of a bit of a salve or some kind of a way of ameliorating the loneliness, the isolation of living in the diaspora. The final example is that I just want to mention is about this movie Ho Xiaoshen. Unfortunately, we can't get the technology to work quite right to show a couple of clips. But I will talk about it, and it is available on Canopy and on Hoopla. I just learned about Hoopla today, so it's basically accessible to anybody who has a library account. That could be a university library or a public library. So, in fact, my account is through the Edmonton Public Library, so I can access it there. So I just want to say, let's see if I have something here about this film. So this film would be Ho Xiaoshen, great Taiwanese director's own intervention and commentary on the martial arts tradition in cinema. So Ho Xiaoshen is a preeminent art house Chinese language filmmaker, has a cult standing in the film studies world, really popular with film aficionados everywhere, including many who can't speak Chinese and know nothing about East Asian society or language at all. And but Ho Xiaoshen himself is a real fan of martial arts, especially martial arts novels, and he has been for his entire life. It turns out he was quite dissatisfied with the way martial arts films are made. He felt like they're overdone, they're overwrought, they're over the top, they're not realistic. And so when he made this film, one of the most notable aspects of it, which I actually talk about it in my book on Ho Xiaoshen, is the hyper realism that he employs to depict the action scenes of the martial arts fighting. So you can actually barely see it in the film. It's just really quick and fast and kind of then it's gone and sort of almost like out of the corner of your eye. And he said the reason why I did that is because think about this, if you were really in this situation and if you were really randomly encountering these kinds of wuxia or martial arts fights, it would happen so fast you would never even see it. So it isn't like this elaborate, drawn out, really histrionic, almost like ballet style, fast forward ballet style martial arts display that you see in the films of so many people, especially the pop ones, King Hu and people like this. But then the more modernist commentaries on it, like Zhang Yimou and Wang Kar-wai. Ho Xiaoshen said this stuff sickens me. This isn't really what the martial arts tradition is, and I'm going to show you what it is. And it's really fast. You can't see it very well at all. And this feeds into his primary philosophy of hyperrealism, of giving people as close to the reality of perception as possible on the screen in all of his films. So it's consistent with what with other stuff he's done. That's not the reason why I bring it up, actually. I bring it up because it suddenly hit me when I was reading Epstein's book and when I was starting to think about this, that this movie, The Assassin, also reflects a very powerful dimension of emotion with respect to the parents. So I'm getting a little tight on time, but if you allow me, I will tell you a little bit about the background of this film. So this film is sort of an adaptation of the Tang Dynasty Quanqi xiaoshuo, a Quanqi short story written in classical Chinese called Nie Yin Yang. So Nie Yin Yang was a female assassin, do exist. Better be careful, because they're tough and they're humorless too. So don't try to joke with them. Right? Just saying, there are several in the Chinese literary tradition. Nie Yin Yang is one of the most famous. In fact, though, what a lot of people, pretty much everyone, has not realized is that Hou Xiaoshen, actually not him per se, but his screenwriters who were Zhu Tianwen, who is a longtime partner of hers, and Zhu Tianwen's niece, Xia Haimeng, essentially wrote the screenplay. And Xia Haimeng, in particular, is a real expert, thanks to her father, on Tang Dynasty cultural history and political history and stuff. So they actually used two stories from the Chuanqi tradition. And one was this story, Nie Yang, excuse me. And the other was another martial arts story called Hong Xian, also about a female knight errant or martial arts assassin, right? So they took elements of both and fused them together for this narrative, which was really actually critical to understand this movie, because in the original story of Nie Yin Yang, the daughter just disappeared one day. Nobody knew why. And she was kidnapped by a Taoist priestess who then trained her in martial arts. By the time she came back, she was an assassin. Her parents were completely mortified and freaked out by this kid who's now a teenager and going around killing people. Okay, just don't kill us, right? Whatever you do. And that's not the way it happened in the movie at all. In the movie, it turns out that the young woman, Nie Yang, was betrothed to the prince of a commandery where they lived. And we think of in the modern era of betrothals in the Chinese tradition and probably Korean too, and Japanese as being like almost like forced marriages, like arranged marriage, bad, loveless, terrible. Okay, but these two actually got along really, really well as children, and they were very devoted to each other. This is addressed in the movie. This is brought out in the movie. And so it was extremely heartbreaking for Nie Yang that she was forced to break off the marriage bond, the engagement to the prince, because the prince had to be re-betrothed to someone to form a political alliance, okay, between two of the commanderies, theirs and their neighboring commandery. And then because the parents were afraid that Nie Yang would be murdered, by the competing family, they actually got rid of her, and they got rid of her by sending her off with a Taoist priestess to hide her, essentially. And that is how, when she was with this Taoist priestess, she was trained in the martial arts. All right. So when she comes back as the assassin several years later, and there's some amazing scenes where it shows this, she's well trained, but she's not this cold-blooded person from the story. She's someone who's clearly suffering from an affective deficit disorder. All right. So she's got profound trauma and not able to express it. But it's because of the heartbreak of the disintegration of that relationship. And then she's also ordered to assassinate the prince, which she does not do. But she comes to terms with the fact that her relationship with him is over, right? And she also comes to terms with the fact that her parents had to do that in order had to get rid of her, had to hide her away for 10 years or however long to save her life. So even though the center of the movie is not on a filial relationship, the filiality and the emotion that's intertwined within it is still extremely important to the story. And I had not even realized that when I wrote about it for my book, even though I had already been thinking. In fact, even in the book, I talk about filiality in other films by Ho Xiaoshen. But actually, Epstein's book brought me to that realization, which I really appreciate. Nevertheless, I just want to say in conclusion that this kind of repositioning of our attention with respect to filiality on the emotional component of it, the affective component, is really, really important. I do think that Epstein goes a bit too far. She's a little bit too extreme. She's a little bit too harsh in her criticism of the May 4th ideology in the modern era. And also, it's not completely the truth, okay? Because the notion that there are negative aspects of filiality is really, really true. And it's a complex thing. It's not a simple black and white thing altogether. But she, through her work, has helped me anyway add a certain layer to it, and I'm grateful for it. And that's my presentation. Thank you.